Welcome to the War Academy channel. Throughout the Second World War, many defensive constructions were built in an attempt to contain the different enemy offensives. Because from 1943, Germany had to go on the defensive on all fronts, it was the country that excelled the most in building these fortifications. The most famous were those of the Gustav or Gothic Line in Italy, the one carried out along the Atlantic coast, called the Atlantic Wall, the Siegfried Line, and of a lesser nature, those that were hastily attempted to be built on the Vistula or in the Oder. But, what we are going to analyze next is, when did they begin to prepare to defend their capital? And how effective were these defenses? Well then, let's see it. Defenses around Berlin began in mid-January 1945, when the Red Army had broken through the German lines on the Vistula front. As we can imagine, the panic for the Germans was total when they saw how at the end of January, the Soviets were located next to the Oder River, just 70 kilometers from Berlin. As we have already analyzed in other programs, there was a strong internal debate in the Soviet High Command, whether to continue quickly towards Berlin, or to consolidate their flanks. The truth is that if they had continued to Berlin, nothing would have come between them. Now returning to the German side, they began to work on some defensive constructions around their capital in an accelerated manner, in the face of the Soviet threat. Within days, a series of trenches were erected on the outskirts of Berlin, and some anti-tank obstacles were set up. Obviously, these defenses would have been a joke if the Soviets had decided to attack. In any case, the so-called Berlin Fortress had its birth here, even if only on paper. One thing that is very striking is that once the Germans saw that the Soviets were not going to launch against Berlin immediately, the construction of these defenses was also paralyzed. By mid-March 1945, Lieutenant General Helmuth Rehmann took command of the defense of Berlin, and it was then that the construction of these defensive rings accelerated. Rehmann was very surprised at the sorry state of these defensive preparations, and from the outset, he was quite pessimistic about the situation. The first lines that had been built were two defensive rings that surrounded Berlin, at a distance between them of between 30 and 50 kilometers. In total, the outer ring was about 230 kilometers in circumference. Basically, these were intermittently poorly dug trench lines, with very few artillery positions and almost no ammunition, and at the main points facing the roads, bunkers had been built to install machine guns. As Rehmann himself pointed out, the most worrying thing was not the poor and scarce material with which the defensive line was equipped, but the lack of trained soldiers to occupy it. In addition to these two defensive rings, in which Rehmann had no hope, there were three other defensive lines inside Berlin's own perimeter. The first of them had a perimeter of about 100 kilometers, and went around the outskirts of the city. Lacking time to build concrete fortifications, old wagons, broken-down vehicles, wreckage, and rubble had to be used to form a barrier around the perimeter. To carry out all this work, it was not possible to resort to any type of machinery, due to the critical lack of fuel, so everything had to be done by hand. Approximately 30,000 to 50,000 Berliners worked day and night in these defensive rings. The second defensive ring in Berlin was considerably more powerful than all those that we have named previously. It had about 40 kilometers of perimeter, and in Rehmann's opinion, these positions could indeed be a solid defensive position, if it were not for the fact that they did not have veteran troops occupying it. The main strength of these positions is that they had taken advantage of the railway lines, which provided perfect anti-tank ditches over 150 meters wide. From the houses that had been fortified around these ditches, and which overlooked the tracks, the enemy could be fired upon from a highly advantageous position. One last positive aspect of this defensive line is that it was already very close to the third inner ring of Berlin, and they could even get to support each other during the battle. This third ring was the one that surrounded the center of the capital, known as the Citadel of Berlin. This last defensive position was located within the arms of the River Spree and the Landwehr Canal, in the district called Mitte. Most of the government buildings were located here, and the final battles were to take place there. In total, Berlin was divided in addition to these three defensive rings, by 8 districts, each with its own commander. Any possible element was used for defense, the most striking being the river courses, the train tracks, any small lake or swamp, and of course, the 3 powerful anti-aircraft towers of Berlin. Despite the precarious buildings and elements of the defensive system, worst of all was the lack of experienced soldiers to occupy the combat positions. Rehmann had estimated that for a proper defense of Berlin, some 200,000 perfectly trained and equipped troops were needed. However, what was available to him was very different. Instead, he had used from the Hitler Youth, most of whom were no more than 15 years old, or members of the Volksturm, who were even over 60 years old. These troops could be added to the members of the Berlin Police and Civic Guard, as well as anti-aircraft crews, and small groups of soldiers who were in the capital. Most of these units reported directly to Goebbels, and more than by military orders, they were guided by political orders. In addition, almost all of them lacked radio communication equipment or vehicles, which would allow them to deploy quickly, or directly be able to communicate with them. Regarding the combat material they had, it must be said that it was the least adequate possible. It is estimated that approximately a third of these units directly lacked rifles, and the groups that did have, in many cases belonged to old equipment from other countries. They were basically rifles that had been captured in countries like France, Italy, Czechoslovakia, Norway, or Belgium. Each of them used a different ammunition, and we can imagine the difficulties this created. Of course, the lack of battle tanks and all kinds of cannons was also total, as were the lack of mines or barbed wire, which are the fundamental axis of any defensive position. Finding himself in this precarious situation, Raymond never hid what he thought about what was going to happen the moment the Soviets attacked. He considered that everything would be useless and that they would be overwhelmed by the Red Army in a few hours. These words caused him to be accused of defeatism, and after several disagreements with Goebbels, he was removed from command on April 22. Despite everything, and under these conditions, the city resisted the furious Soviet offensive for about 10 days, surpassing any forecast that commanders like Raymond had made. Well, that's it for today's program, which I hope has been of total interest to you. What is your opinion on this matter? I leave you in the description a recent video that we uploaded, in which we analyze the same situation, but from the point of view of the civilian population. In this program, we analyze what life was like in Berlin for civilians, during the days before the battle. And well, here we end. Thank you all very much, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you in the next video. See you soon.